So welcome to this lecture, and it is going to be on the topic of biomedical sensing and acquisition. You can appreciate, the biomedical world, the physical world, the real world is analog in nature, but we do most of the computations and processing in the digital world. So later we will see ways to convert analog to digital. But before we do that process, one of the main aspects is to make sure we do a proper measurement and proper sensing of those physical variables, which we call as physiological signals. So if you look into the human body, there are 6 major levels of organization. We could see it at the chemical level, made up of atomic structure and also subatomic particles. We could see it at the cellular level, a level higher than the chemical level, where the ionic reactions happen. And this is where we get the life. So the fundamental life starts at the cellular level. Then when different cells come into combination, it leads to a tissue structure. And there could be 4 major types of tissues, for example, muscle tissues, nervous tissues, and so forth. Then we can see things at the organ level, which could be, for example, brain, heart, lung, and things like that. Then we can also see as a systems point of view, like circulatory system, where we have the involvement of the heart, the veins and arteries and things like that. And finally, the whole organism. So if you see the 6 levels of organization, in all these cases, you could turn this into a separate topic by itself. But what's relevant to the course, because this course being on signals and system and the interaction of that, when we start to see the biomedical things as systems, then from your knowledge of systems theory, there is always an input that goes into the system and your own output. So typically we assume the input to be variable X and the output to be Y. In most cases, when we do the processing of the signals, it's that we are processing the output Y. In other words, we are processing the effect of this whole process. We are not really looking into the causal aspects of it. We assume the causal to be known, or in many cases, we just assume it to be an impulse. So that's why we call it as impulse response of the system. So we'll get to learn more of this as we go along the course, but just wanted to point out that we are looking into biomedical signals more from the organ level, but it's also good to understand what is happening at the cellular level. You would have seen that probably in your previous courses, because that's the fundamental aspect of the human life is a cell. And you would have been exposed to the concept of the cell potential. Cell, just like the complex human body, has all kinds of properties. It can evolve, it can morph, it can reproduce. It also has electrical potential because of the ionic content. So when the cell is not activated, we call the resting membrane potential. Basically the presence of ions like sodium and potassium, calcium and chloride and other ions. In most cases, we tend to measure the potential from the inside of the cell. So with regards to the inside of the cell, where there is a negative concentration or a negative gradient, because you would have heard something called the sodium-potassium pump in a resting membrane potential. So we have normally more potassium ions outside the cell and a lesser concentration of positive ions, the potassium ions inside the cell. So that creates an electrical gradient. And when you tend to measure the voltage level from within the cell, you always get a negative voltage. So typically the resting membrane potential tends to be minus 70 millivolts. Okay. But the action potential is something that happens because of some stimuli. And it typically corresponds to a physiological activity. And the stimuli could be something like a neural or an external stimuli that basically produces the response in the form of an AP or action potential. You got to remember that AP or action potential is the basic component of all bioelectric signals. It's the basic component of all bioelectric signals. And typical excitable cells includes neurons, which you will see very soon, myocytes, muscle cells, and they also communicate with each other. That's the beauty of it. Okay? So if I wanted to do a dynamic action in the human body, for example, move my arm, then this excitable cell from the brain is basically communicating to the nerve cells that are present in the other parts of the body. Okay? So this communication is happening at a rapid pace, and you might be already familiar with that, especially in many cases it happens to the spinal cord. And continuing on the action potential concept, as indicated, the presence of these ions, sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, and also to some extent other ions, contributes to this electrical property or the battery-like property of the cells. This change in electrical potential from the circuits concept creates a gradient or a potential difference, which could be seen as a voltage. And as indicated before, the typical voltage level of the cells tends to be in millivolts. So microvolts to millivolts, and it's good enough because these could be detected easily by using electronic instrumentation. The membranes of the cell play a central role in generating action potentials, and we will see a graph in the next slide which will mention it or correspond to that. So this graph is what I was indicating, and if you see this graph, you have to be pretty clear with what's going on with the x-axis and the y-axis. Okay, at the x-axis, it's the time scale, and the time scale is in milliseconds. So what's happening in the x-axis is all in milliseconds range. And if you see the y-axis, it's the voltage, and this voltage is typically, as I mentioned, is in millivolts. Okay. And if you notice this, what's in the red color is one cycle of the action potential. So initially, the cell is at rest. It's called the resting membrane potential, typically at minus 70 millivolt. When it receives a stimuli, basically reorganization of the ionic concentration, and if that stimuli is strong enough to cross the threshold value of minus 55 millivolts, then it really shoots up, and that's called the depolarization wave. The cell is called to be depolarized. It reaches a peak of around 40 millivolts, not larger than that. Then again, it starts to repolarize. The cell starts to repolarize, and in the repolarization phase, it basically goes down and passes this resting state potential and kind of goes through a refractory period and comes back to the RMP, resting membrane potential again. So this happens typically in one cycle of any cell. It's important to note that during this period, which is called the absolute refractory period, the period between the stimuli and where the repolarization is sitting, the resting state, it's called the absolute refractory period. During that period, you cannot initiate another stimuli. In other words, there won't be any peak activity that would happen within the absolute refractory period. This late refractory period, which is coming later, is because of the slow movement of the ions is causing this drag, okay, this drag. So this is a nice, typical cycle, and So this is an example of how it looks like with a neuron and also with a myocyte, which is a cardiac cell myocyte. And if you see here, in the case of a neuron, this aspect of the absolute refractive period, this period is essentially 1 millisecond. Okay, so it really repolarizes very rapidly. So that's what happens with the nerve and most of the muscle cells. But when we come into myocytes, especially the heart myocytes, the refractory phase tends to be between 150 to 300 milliseconds. So it's slightly longer compared to the nerve cells. This is very important to remember, because when we get into the morphology of signals such as electrocardiogram, ECG, this refractory period plays a significant role in it. The very first signal that I would like to introduce to you, which you would have seen in other aspects, but I wanted to reinforce this because you would be seeing more of these signals and the properties and the tools to analyze them in this course. So I would start with electromyogram, or EMG. EMG, I mean, if you see this diagram here, it shows the anatomy of EMG signal, the skeletal muscle fibers. It shows a physiological model with the spinal cord and the motor unit action potentials, how they get generated and added up. That's a physiological model. And finally, instrumentation to measure EMG. EMG measurements tends to be, in most cases, slightly invasive because of the needle requirement, so we can record muscle potential quite reliably. So it tends to be somewhat invasive, but there are also many non-invasive means to get the electromyogram recorded. In case of EMG, one thing you need to remember is what's called SMUAP, or single motor unit action potential. Unlike other physiological signals, EMG could be quite easily represented using SMUAPs. And you will see in the subsequent diagrams that it's basically coming because of the summation of the individual action potentials. It's obvious thing. There are many cells which correspond to a tissue like muscle. So these cells come into interplay among themselves and generate the summation effect in the form of SMUAPs. In case of a normal EMG, the single motor unit action potential tends to be either monophasic, biphasic. In some cases, it could be triphasic. But when things get abnormal or pathological, it could be polyphasic. So just to put a context to how these waveforms looks like, monophasic waveform has one phase, and this is an example of a monophasic wave. This is an example of a biphasic waveform, and obviously this is an example of a triphasic waveform. So when you have any of these morphology or shape in your signal, it typically corresponds to a normal EMG. But the moment you encounter polyphasic, and it's much more than a triphasic, then it could imply there is something wrong with the EMG signal. Okay. The two main aspects people work with EMG is in neuropathy and myopathy. Neuropathy, as the name indicates, to do with neurological or nervous disorders. And just as I indicated here, the shape of the waveforms tend to be polyphasic. There is also a myopathic thing, which is typically related to muscle weakness. And it could be any muscles. It's even the muscle that controls your eye movement, for example. Or it could be the femoral muscle, which controls your leg movement. So it could be this huge range of muscles that could correspond to myopathy. This is a graph or a plot that shows how an EMG is really produced through the muscle unit contraction. So when the brain is sending the neural signal, it propagates as action potentials in the nervous system. Here it could be, for example, the spinal cord could be the nervous system. Then the motor unit potentials, the MUs, are generated from the muscle fibers. And the output, which is sensed, is basically a muscle unit, a contraction or MU contraction. When many of these muscle unit or motor units come together, when you add them all together, that relates to the single motor unit action potential that we just talked about. Okay. So it's neat in many signal processing approaches, we will see later, that we could take an EMG signal, which is basically a string of SMUAPs, and go through a signal processing framework and probably get into the individual motor units. Okay, so even by using some mathematical filtering, we can reverse the process. Okay, we can understand the process, how a single motor unit potential was generated. Okay. And when the SMUPs gets added, that's where we get the EMGs. And this additional operation could also be reversed, and we can also start to understand what's happening at the individual motor unit level or at the individual cellular level, okay, if you do a right mathematical transformation. This is a real world example of an EMG recorded from the diaphragm muscle of a dog using fine wire electrodes, slightly invasive process. So if you look into this EMG signal, definitely many people will think it is noise. It's definitely not noise, because it's just the amalgamation of the SMUAPs, which we talked in the previous slide. They all get added here. Going forward, there are many ways you could also measure EMG non-invasively. So what we saw in the previous slide was more like a clinical grade instrumentation to collect EMG, but you could also collect EMGs using wearable devices. And one example of such a wearable devices is the Mayo controller from Thalmic Labs. So it's a Canadian innovation where they've generated this armband which could be used in recognizing your EMG signals and can be used for controlling devices and other aspects of human-computer interaction just by using gesture recognition, which is just using machine learning on the EMG signals that we collected. So this video that I'm going to play is going to show like how So that was an example of an EMG device which was used to control various consumer devices. And it's basically based on EMG recognition from the forearms using signal processing and machine learning, then controlling the devices using a wireless connection, something like a Bluetooth or even a Wi-Fi. So the next important signal that we will be looking into in this course is EEG, the electroencephalogram. And EEG is, as you are aware, relates to the brain waves or the electrical activity of the brain. It's one of the non-invasive way to examine the brain functionality. And in many cases, that EEG could be controlled through an external stimuli. And most of the time, we tend to use wet electrodes to enhance the contact between the scalp and the sensors to increase the signal quality. Also, lately, many dry electrode methodologies are coming. So you don't have to put a gel. You just put these electrodes directly on the scalp and it can give a decent quality EEG signals. Now, in terms of the brain anatomy, this is what could be seen as different lobes. The frontal lobe controls many aspects of your life, like movement, emotions, memory, language, and things like that, behavior and personalities. The temporal lobe relates to speech and hearing. The parietal lobe relates to bodily sensations. The occipital lobe relates to the vision. And balance and coordination and breathing, heart rate and temperature is related to the brainstem. And also it relates to the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. So the functionality of the brain has been pretty much understood from these various lobes, but we are not using any structural imaging of the brain in the course because this is about signaling. We are going to collect the electrical activity or the neural activity of the brain in the form of a waveform. But we have to use this waveform to understand the functional and the dynamic aspect of the brain. The EEGs will not provide a very good structural information, but it provides good temporal and functional information. So it's complementary to what one could get from things like magnetic resonance imaging or MRI. But advancements of MRI, like the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, can give, in addition to the structural image, it can also give somewhat of a temporal or functional variations, but it's not very high temporal resolution with fMRI, so we have to rely on things like EEG to do that. Typically, EEG placements is like this. So if this is the frontal lobe, frontal lobe electrodes are placed in this type of configuration. And the configuration is called 10-20 electrode placement system. It's basically you divide the brain region either from the front to back or from left to right, either in 10% intervals between adjacent electrodes of the total length or in 20% intervals. Okay, so it's just the placement between the electrodes is what's called 10-20 electrode placement system. And with this type of a setup, it leads to multi-channel information, basically getting some idea about the structural functioning of the brain, at least to the level of lobes, but not to a very deeper level or a granular level of the functioning of the brain. But important thing is that it could be collected continuously. And as you could imagine, EEGs are very successful in many medical applications. We will see that later, specifically in things like sleep, where you need to record the signal on a continual basis. This is how an EEG signal looks like. And coming to this point, it's very hard to see EEG in the same lines as an EMG. EMG, we had a very nice setup, action potentials giving motor unit and motor unit giving SM UAPs, single motor unit action potentials, and they get added to give EMG. Whereas in EEG, it's very difficult to provide that kind of a pipeline framework. It's just because the signal is very highly dynamic and it comes from various brain connectivity activities as well. Okay? Though you might be picking up, for example, an EEG channel from FPZ, for example, but it might have a leakage from your adjacent channels. Okay? They could aid in information decision making, or they could act as an interference. Okay? So that's why EEG is very interesting from a signal processing point of view, because it's not an easy signal to analyze. It doesn't have a very well-defined morphology, and sometimes it's also not easy to get the rhythm understood properly from the EEG. But having said that, people have come up with 4 common frequency bands or spectral bands of EEG activities. The delta band, I mean, again, it's not sequential, like the names are quite jumbled here, because people in the initial stages were only working on alpha and beta. Then later they discovered a delta and theta waves. So in delta wave, the frequency of that waveform is typically between 0.5 hertz to 4 hertz, very low frequency. In the theta band, it's between 4 to 8 hertz. Alpha is 8 to 13, and beta is typically above 13 hertz. Okay. So that's kind of the spectral alignment of EEG. I mean, that's one of the best information available for EEG, but we don't have much information about how the waveform shape looks like, and also whether that waveform shape might have some rhythm. Okay, it might have some rhythm, but it's not very well understood, or it's not obvious in the signal representation. So these are further examples of those waveforms that I just showed. One thing I wanted to point out is that yes, A, B, C, D are the 4 waveforms that we just talked about. But this is an example, E and F are an example where when a person opens the eye, you could see how the alpha rhythm is getting blocked. Okay? So this alpha rhythm, and the eye has been opened, the alpha rhythm is blocked. In other words, it becomes more or less like a DC waveform. And it's kind of DC until the eye has been shut, and when it's open again, then the alpha is back. Okay, so this indicates even a simple opening of the eye, the blinking of the eye, could corrupt your waveforms. Okay, could mislead your signals. Okay, it's important because in a lot of the EEG experiments, you got to have the protocol well aligned, well designed. Otherwise, you are basically doing wrong analysis. It's important to remember, to be a good signal processing engineer, you need to collect good data. Okay? It's the concept of which I will keep referring to called GIGO, good input, good output. Okay? If you have a garbage input, you can't do much, you will get a garbage output. Okay? So you got to be absolutely sure the signal quality and the measurement aspects are properly designed so that we are basically getting insights and information from the signals. The various properties of these waveforms, which you will probably already know from your earlier exposure to this EEG concept, or you will learn throughout the course. Okay? For example, the alpha rhythm is principal resting rhythm of the brain. Okay? And it's typically, when the person is in a relaxed state. So in addition to the physical health that could be monitoring EEG, definitely there are a lot of growing applications in the mental health sector also. The delta wave, which is a very slow wave, basically corresponds to the release of hormones from the body, and in many cases it corresponds to the deep sleep stages. So if a sleep technician wants to grade the sleep quality, they look for delta waves. It means that that person has entered into a deep sleep stage. The theta waveform, which is between 4 to 8 hertz, normally corresponds to drowsiness. Okay, and even in some cases it could be meditative. See, so it's just a pre-sleep condition, and this is also getting very popular, especially in driving applications. Drowsy driving and accidents is a very common thing, and people want to detect whether somebody is under some kind of an influence or drowsy, and the waveform they look for is the theta waveform, which is between 4 to 8 hertz. Then comes slightly higher frequency, the beta waves, which is above 13 hertz. Normally, in this case, the amplitude of the waveform is smaller, but it has a higher frequency compared to the other 3 bands. It might represent if somebody is in an anxiety level or quite stressed. And typically during examination times, this is a very common waveform that we could expect. So similar to what we saw with EMG, there is also wearable devices that has come out in the EEG sectors, which can detect brain waves non-invasively, and this could be even held with us at home. So you don't have to really go to a lab or a clinical setup to get some form of EEG or brainwaves. So the Muse is one example of that. And again, it's coming from a Toronto company by name Interaxon. They're kind of world leaders in wearable EEGs. So this is how it looks like. It's kind of very sleek, and it connects to your phone through an app. So waveforms could be continuously recorded and kept and analyzed for deeper understanding of the brain functioning, specifically the frontal lobe functioning of the brain. And this is where you see the different electrodes. And I think there are 5 electrodes that are sensing your brain waves from the frontal lobe. And we'll play a video here to show again Muse, the brain sensing headband.
You exercise to keep your body healthy. Now you can do the same with your mind. Muse, the brain sensing headband, is an easy to use brain fitness tool that helps you reduce stress, improve focus, and increase concentration, all in just 3 minutes a day. Muse guides you through a focused attention exercise, measuring your brain waves the same way a heart rate monitor measures your pulse. Then Muse gives you in-the-moment feedback you can track over time. Build a better brain in as little as 3 minutes a day with Muse, the brain sensing headband. Muse helps you train your brain so you can do more with your mind and more with your life. Learn more at choosemuse.com.
So again, this is a very neat device. I mean, as you could see, it has quite a bit of functionality. It doesn't record the many channels that we expect in a clinical grade EEG, but whatever we get out of wearable EEG devices like Muse could be used for functionalities like in meditative world, in the area of brain-computer interaction or human-computer interaction, where people have difficulty navigating. For example, using their walker or a wheelchair, that Muse will come in very handy. So these are all constantly evolving. There are many products that are coming out these days. Wearable devices are getting common, which also allows, as I said, to do a lot of things in a telemedicine way. You could do things from home, and you don't have to have people been hospitalized all the time and being hooked up to complex instrumentation. So with this understanding of EMG and EEG, I just want to go through a quick snapshot about some of the facts of the adult human brain. And though I said there are 10 facts, but I'm just going to quickly cover the 4 important ones that you should probably know or you already know. So brain is capable of surviving 5 to 6 minutes without oxygen. Okay, so that's why when there is a 911 call being made, they have to reach to the patient within 5 minutes. Okay, so otherwise, both your brain and heart might not be functioning after that without oxygen. This is very interesting. If you take the blood vessels and you spread it, they go 100,000 miles in length. Okay. So each one of us right now in our brain are having blood vessels which are of length of 100,000 miles. Okay. Also, interestingly, I mean, I tell we are all billionaires. We are all billionaires because all our brains have 100 billion neurons. 100 billion neurons. Okay. Pretty impressive. Okay. So all those neurons are already interacting. They all produce action potentials, and that's what we are kind of using, what I call the natural neural network, to control various things, our memory, cognition, and things like that. Okay. Now we are trying to mimic that through computers in the form of artificial neural network, basically mimicking what the brain does in terms of learning and memory and things like that. Other interesting fact is that during the early stages of pregnancy, the neurons developed at a rapid rate of 250,000 neurons per minute. Okay. So these are very amazing natural facts. Okay. There are many forms of brain-related issues. Brain injuries, concussions and stroke are very important areas of research. And you can easily realize EEGs can play a very important role here, also the EMGs. Brain tumors, which normally leads to headaches and seizures, could also be analyzed using EEG waveforms. Neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and dementia could very much be analyzed using both EMG and EEG. Same holds with neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism. Also with mental disorders, just I indicated, EEG can play a significant role. So in terms of the neural engineering applications, there are many, many applications, and I am sure some of you will take it further in your thesis projects or your other projects, either with your industry or research or even in your future career. So what we would consider as the breakthroughs in the area of neural engineering. Okay. So I've just put what I consider as 3 important breakthroughs. Okay. So right now, in terms of understanding the brain functioning, we can have high energy MRI machines. Okay. MRI machines are normally quoted using the unit Tesla. So currently in most clinics, you have 1.5 or 3 Tesla MRI images. So the one you see on the right side is produced by a very high energy MRI machine. And you've got to be very careful when we use very high energy, because it has to be safe to the human body and the brain. So 9.4 Tesla images produce this amazing quality and in-depth information about the brain vessels. So you can get information at an unprecedented level. I think even now, I mean, people are researching 14 Tesla MRI images. A lot of things could be achieved with this. 14 Tesla MRI images could be spectacular, and not many places have it, because obviously it's a very expensive thing to have. But the common thing clinically is 1.5 and 3 Tesla. In the research stage, we have about 70 are being tried out. So this is a significant breakthrough in terms of understanding the brain structure. And when we have the functional aspects and the EEG things added, we can also get the behavioral and the functional characteristics of the brain. The second breakthrough is that typically when we wanted to understand organs and things like that, rather than testing it out on humans or animals, it's good to work it out with synthetic models, okay, or models that are developed in labs. So lab-grown brains is one other breakthrough people are achieving through tissue engineering concepts, growing of brains on lab. They call brain on a chip. They call organ on a chip. Applications are growing across the world. So this is a second breakthrough. In terms of the third breakthrough, which is coming from within Toronto, in fact, there's something called the blood-brain barrier, or 3 Bs. Blood-brain barrier is important because it keeps infection out of the brain, and also it's not easy to get into the blood-brain barrier if you want to do any treatment. Okay. So it acts as a nice barrier for pathogens and things like that. But if anything has to be done with regards to therapy, it's not easy. The one means to reach the blood-brain barrier would be using a deep therapy in the form of ultrasounds. So ultrasonic waveforms, when it's focused, it could break the barrier, and that's what was shown through the Sunnybrook experiment 2-3 years ago. Okay. This helps tremendously because it can help with people with tremor problems. When somebody is having Parkinson's, they have a tremor problem. And you can see through the internet that a successful reach of the blood-brain barrier through the ultrasound technique has suppressed the tremor from a Parkinson's subject. Okay, so this is tremendous. So we are really impacting, or we are stimulating the brain totally non-invasively and achieving these amazing results. So I consider this as the third major breakthrough in the brain research. The many other areas where you could get involved, you could get affiliated. This is a fantastic and emerging area. Whatever is highlighted in the red color is, I think, could be seen more from both signal processing and machine learning point of view. So I've been talking about brain machine interface or brain computer interface. Basically, you're using brain signals to interact with a machine or control a machine or use a computer, has tremendous applications in neuro rehab and assistive technologies. Neural control, neuro rehabilitation, neurodiagnostics, again, will benefit tremendously from EEG signals. Either it could be a car accident or spinal cord injury related issues, or losing of a limb. In medical robotics, they all have applications. Imaging, neuroimaging, we just talked about that. A lot of work could be done, not only MRI, even other areas of imaging, where signals will play an important role in getting the temporal aspects and the functional aspects. And also in understanding the neuroscience. I mean, the biggest research that everybody is looking into in brain is understanding consciousness, understanding aspects of dream, why people dream, for example. These are all areas of in-depth research that could be done, and quite a bit of unknowns are still there. It continues to be there, continues to be mystery. So it's always inspiring to be involved in areas like that. The final slide of this module is on event-related potentials, and I indicated before with an example that when you open and close your eyes, or when you're blinking, that will have an impact on the EEG in the alpha wave, for example. So event-related potentials could be visual through the eyes, or it could be auditory. I wanted to point this out because event-related potentials, through the various stimuli, we record the response in the form of EEG, but they tend to have a very low signal-to-noise ratio, very low SNR. When you have a very low SNR, not much information could be gained out of it. Okay? So that's why in your lab 1, which basically starting today, for the next 2 weeks, you would be working on some of the event-related potential that has been given to you, and you will try to increase the signal-to-noise ratio by using a very simple form, but an effective form of filtering called synchronized averaging. So you will see that signals are coming from a hospital, a local hospital, real-world signals. So when you do synchronized averaging on the ERPs, you will see an increase in signal-to-noise ratio. But after a certain level, you won't see much increase in ERP. It's not to do anything with the synchronized averaging process. It's something to do with the brain. The brain tends to have a property called habituation. In other words, after a certain number of stimuli, it learns it. It gets habituated with the signals, and the work potential amplitudes are not very substantial. Okay? So you will also see the effect of what's called habituation in the lab 1 experiment. Okay, thank you very much for the attention.